Take note of how experienced this pathologist is. It's quite a CV. He's a former chief medical examiner for New York City, where he worked for 25 years. He's the former lead examiner for the New York State Police. He was the chairperson of the forensic pathology panel that reinvestigated the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. In the 80s, he was brought in by the Russian government to examine the remains of the last emperor, Nicholas II. He has completed more than 20,000 autopsies and for a time was in charge of examining all deaths in New York City jails. He's not a crank and he's not a conspiracy theorist. He was in the room when the Jeffrey Epstein autopsy took place. He is Michael Baden, and he believes Jeffrey Epstein was murdered. Hello and welcome to this edition of This Much is True Crime with me, Martin Frizell, and Emeritus Professor of Criminology, David Wilson. Hello, David.
It's very nice to be with you again.
Are we going to fall out over this one? Because I think there's unanswered questions with Epstein, but you're quite sure it's closed case in terms of how he died.
Well, if it just shows how live this podcast is, because I didn't know you were about to read out Michael Baden's CV. And if I'd known you were going to do that, I probably would have found out more about Barbara Sampson's CV, who is currently the New York City medical examiner.
Who wasn't in the room when the autopsy took place.
Oh, she was?
No, she wasn't. No, she wasn't in the room. It was a different pathologist who carried out the autopsy. She was you're right, she was in charge of it, and she signed it off, but she wasn't in the autopsy room.
Well, she sticks by her conclusion that this was suicide. And even though you're quite right, Michael Baden has a very impressive track record. He's not a crank. But his claim that this was murder, as opposed to suicide, is because of something which is fairly well known if you're interested in forensic science, forensic medicine, which is that he claims that the breakages to the larynx and to the hyoid bone are indicative of murder as opposed to strangulation as a result of suicide. The only downside with what you have said is that those kinds of breakages to the bones would be more common in an older person than a younger person. And Epstein at the time of his death was 66. And so it's not inconsistent with suicide at all. And I think the other thing that you didn't put into your analysis when you were reading out Michael Baden's CV.
It was only 30 seconds. Give me a chance.
The other thing that the other thing you didn't put into that analysis is that, of course, Michael Baden was hired by the Epstein family.
As was their right to have someone in the room.
Absolutely. It was their right. But if you're hired by the family and the family don't want to accept that he may have died by suicide, you're going to side with the family that's paying you money to make an opinion about what it is that you might think in relation to the medical evidence that's presented.
Well, you can look at that too, as you could argue that, on the prosecution side of it, the authorities are paid to certainly to look at autopsies, to find a reason for death. But of course, they're paid by the state. They're paid by the authorities who were prosecuting Epstein, who were taking him to court.
Well, all I can say is that reason that we're discussing this again, because we've discussed the Epstein death before. The reason we're discussing this again is because of the continuing release of materials related to the Epstein files. Various things have been released that have talked about what happens in the...
Including pictures, so very graphic pictures of him pretty much in a hospital. Come on to this as well. Pictures, they weren't quite sure where the pictures were taken, but he's dead. And to me, they look like hospital, not the cell where allegedly, he hanged himself. But also there are copies of the autopsy report, quite a lot of redactions in it. But Mr. Baden would suggest that backs up what his theory was.
Well, that's it. I mean, I accept that there are new materials as a result, new things to say as a result of this release of documents. But at the end of the day, this has been thoroughly researched. Barbara Sampson is standing by her original verdict that this was suicide. There was an FBI and there was a DOJ report about this published in 2023. And basically, the Attorney General said, and I think I'm quoting, this was a perfect storm of screw-ups. And the suicide was caused by negligence, misconduct, and outright job performance failures. And when I looked, I mean, I read the DOJ report, which went on and on and on, and it was quite clear that this really was a set of circumstances that I think Epstein wanted to take advantage of, all those jobs. I think he kind of groomed the staff in that unit to accept that he was okay, whereas in fact there was a history to Epstein in the jail where he had previously attempted suicide.
Well, they suggest that it didn't necessarily mean he was trying to take his own life. It was the cellmate, they would argue, those who say that he didn't, that attacked him.
Well, this is somebody called Nicholas Tartaglione, and I became really intrigued by Nicholas Tartaglione. And in the same way that you did a bit of research about Michael Baden, I did some research about Nicholas Tartaglione, who used to be a police officer, because I kept thinking, well, why would and he's eventually going to be convicted of a number of murders, Nicholas Tartaglione. And I kept thinking, well, why was he in the special housing that Epstein would be in? Because that was kind of unusual for me. But then I realized it was because of his previous work in law enforcement. He would have to be protected and therefore away from the mainstream prison population. But Nicholas Tartaglione gave some really open and honest accounts of what happened. And of course, the reason why that Epstein didn't want to say he had attempted suicide was because that's actually against prison discipline, and he would have been charged as a consequence of that. The other things that we've got to keep putting into this, I know you're not a conspiracy theorist. Remember, it was only 2 days prior to Epstein's death that he had signed his last will and testimony. It was, he had no cellmate. His cellmate had just been moved to another prison. A new cellmate hadn't come into the jail. And I think that, and he'd just seen his lawyers. I think everything seemed to me to say this is suicide. You will want to point out, as you did the first time we discussed this, about the cameras not working for a short period of time. And as I keep saying, you know, to manually strangle someone takes much longer than the time the cameras weren't working.
Lots of things weren't working in that correction center, and the staff have been accused of various things, and it wasn't fit for purpose. Let's face it. So there were a catalogue of errors, but also the pathologist on the family side is suggesting that he looked at what was left in the cell and the noose that Epstein was alleged to have hung himself with, and it was made from bed sheets which were soft, and that was from a different. He believes that was from a different kind. What the actual noose that killed him, if that's the case, that was the ligature, was of a different material to a bed sheet.
Well, I've seen people, sadly, in my work in prisons, I've seen people commit suicide using bootlaces, shoelaces. So I don't place so much emphasis on the fact that the bed sheet was different to, the bed sheets were different to the noose and how the noose was constructed, because it's quite clear that Epstein, because he was a high-profile prisoner, was incredibly wealthy, would have been able, staff have been sacked in that jail as a consequence of what went on. Remember, staff were falsifying documents saying they were checking on him when they weren't checking on him. All of that seems to me that Epstein was probably able to manipulate the prison circumstances in which he found himself to such an extent, if the noose was fashioned out of bed sheets that didn't fit the bed sheets that were on the bed. I don't think that's particularly significant.
His brother Mark clearly thinks there's more to answer here, and he's not accepting that his brother took his own life. So, armed with the pathologist report we're speaking about, he's also instructed another team of independent pathologists, and he says they're going to come out later on this year with bombshell findings. I presume the only conclusion you can take from that is that they're going to say as well that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered. And you can see why it's plausible, because there are a lot of people who would like him silenced.
Well, that's also true, but you have to go on the evidence that is there. You have to go on the evidence that is available to us. And just because there might be some people in whose interests it would be that Epstein was murdered doesn't mean to say he was murdered. And all of the evidence that currently has, and there have been some really proper investigations. I read the DOJ report, which ran to hundreds of pages, and it seemed to me that that was a thorough and responsible report, and I felt it was being authentic and honest. He commits suicide, and he commits suicide, I think, because that's a form of control. I think it's a way that he keeps managing the fact that he doesn't see a future for him. And in those circumstances, it's best that he keeps control of what's going to happen to him by taking his own life.
Michael Baden, as I said, he was heavily involved in New York and jails and studying deaths in jails. He says that going in over 1,000 jail hangings, suicides in New York state prisons over the past 40 to 50 years, and over 1,000 there have been in the past 40 to 50 years, not a single one had 3 fractures on their necks. Now, he's suggesting that's really important because it was a crushing, and he would say it's more like, he actually used the analogy of like you would see in the Godfather films. It's someone coming, if you're driving the car, someone coming from behind you with a ligature and strangling you that way, as opposed to hanging, which would mean there would be almost like vertical signs on your neck and chin that you had hung yourself.
Well, and I mean, you quite rightly started with Michael Baden's background, and it is a very impressive background. And so all I can say in relation to that argument is this, that the age of people who would typically go to prison tend to be young men, tend to be in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s. And in those circumstances, the kinds of injury one saw in a 66-year-old man, Epstein himself, the kind of injuries that one see in a much older man would be different from those that would typically be encountered by younger men. And younger men, by and large, are going to be incarcerated, and it will be younger men that Michael Baden will have encountered who have taken their own life whilst they have been in prison.
The catalogue of errors that happened in that jail are astonishing. Possibly you can understand they would make mistakes because they didn't know then what we know now, just in terms of how this is, quite frankly, the biggest crime scandal, paedophile network story of modern times. It's massive, the Epstein files. It could bring down, who knows, it could bring down some very influential people around the world. Even the president's linked to it. They knew it was a big story, but at the time, catalogue of mistakes made, including there weren't any pictures taken of him being found in the cell. The pictures that have been released on the Epstein files just recently, I'm sure, are from the hospital. There's no actual picture of the scene of death with his body lying there as well. Also, they lost the time of death as well, because he wasn't found until the next morning. So all those things would have helped. It's just astonishing that, it wasn't taken more seriously, or was it taken seriously and he was allowed to be killed?
I think Epstein was very good at grooming people. And I think he groomed his guards into them believing they didn't need to check on the hour when they were supposed to check. He was also very good
He had to put in suicide watch, though.
And they signed saying he was on, that he was being checked as per a suicide watch. They also knew that his cellmate, he was supposed to have a cellmate because the psychologist that had seen him as a result of the incident with Nicholas Tartiglione had said he should have a cellmate. But the cellmate had just been transferred, so he was by himself. Now, I don't think there were any photographs taken because by and large, you don't have cameras in prison. So that to me wasn't surprising. And so those photographs probably did come from the hospital when they removed him from the prison to wherever it was that there was going to be some kind of proper medical examination. I don't find any of that unusual. That's very typical, it seems to me, in terms of what happens when you are faced with this kind of high-profile incident. You know, what you've got to get into, if you believe everything that you've been saying, is that there was a conspiracy to murder him and it was successful. Now, we're back into who shot JFK in a sense, because you raised that. There was the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission said it was Lee Harvey Oswald that was operating by himself for whatever reason that Lee Harvey Oswald wanted to take John Kennedy's life. I just don't see this as the conspiracy that people would like it to be for whatever reason they believe that their Epstein was murdered. You could probably point out, though, do you remember Rick Rolling? Do you remember that?
Rings a bell.
What was he called? Rick Astley. Never gonna give you up. Never gonna, you know, it became a meme. It became something that transcended the song and Rick Astley.
What's this got to do with Jeffrey Epstein?
Because that's in a sense where we are with Jeffrey Epstein, isn't it? Because it's become a meme. Epstein didn't kill himself. That's the meme. It becomes something that transcends what actually happened, because what's really being expressed by this disbelief that he took his own life is a distrust of government. People don't want to believe government, and therefore, you know, what is it? The majority of the American population believe that Epstein didn't take his own life, that he was murdered. I mean, that's simply revealing that culturally at the moment, there are very, very few people who actually trust government and who actually therefore trust that government couldn't be engaging in a conspiracy to kill Epstein for whatever reason.
But they have a right to query and to question, don't they? Going back to the 60s. I mean, I've actually been to Dallas. I've been to that grassy knoll where the famous video was taken as John F.K. came past and was shot in the head. And 60% of Americans still think that there was something else going on. It wasn't just a lone gunman that was being put up to it. They don't accept that, you know, whether he was a Marxist or whatever it was, they think there was more of a conspiracy there. Likewise with Epstein. So it's almost like who killed JFK is the old one. The modern day version of that is who killed Epstein, almost, in terms of the whole industry of doubt that has grown up around it. Now, lots of polls have been done amongst the American public as to, you know, what do they think? Was he murdered? Did he hang himself? Whatever it is. I've taken one from The Economist, which is probably sort of one of the most respected organs to run a poll. This is from August 2025. Question was, how did Epstein die? Suicide, 16%. Unsure, 34%. And this is from Economist readers. Murdered, 50%.
Well, I think you would get those figures even higher if you looked at some of the American polls that have been taken more recently, because the idea that he did not take his own life, but was instead murdered, has gained even greater traction as the months have gone on. Listen, though, I saw a poll recently from the United States where a significant minority of Americans think that Epstein is still alive. He's living on his ranch in New Mexico. So, you know, these polls can tell you anything, it seems to me. And what we've got to always return to, whether we're talking about JFK, whether we're talking about Robert Kennedy, whether we're talking about Martin Luther King, you return to the facts, you return to the evidence, And at the end of the day, does the evidence support this narrative, or does it support a completely different narrative? And everything I've seen, with the exception of Michael Baden, because I think he is a credible person, with the exception of Michael Baden, everything I've seen points to, a remarkable litany of errors in a dysfunctional jail with staff who are behaving unprofessionally, which allows Jeffrey Epstein to kill himself. And as long as we continue to talk about the murder or suicide, we're not talking about the other issues that still interest me about the Epstein files, which is, to what extent will any man in the United States face a charge in relation to what we know was happening to young women, underage girls who are being sexually abused and trafficked by Epstein and his cronies. I think that's the thing that we should keep focusing on, as opposed to what I think is something that's a non-story. Epstein took his own life.
There's a lot of worried people out there who had connections to Epstein, including the banks, big time. They're falling over themselves to pay millions and millions and millions to Epstein's victims. Another bank just this week, JP Morgan before. I'm not saying they were laundering at all, but they were involved in money that was coming in or going through Epstein's account. So they're wanting to, quite clearly wash their hands of anything to do with Epstein, and they're paying out big time. And I think as well, as you said, the scandalous thing about all of this is, of course, the victims, but there's only one person who has been banged up for this so far, and it's Ghislaine Maxwell.
And
it's a woman.
And I think she should be banged up. Yes. I think Ghislaine Maxwell should be in jail. And of course, it's very interesting that she got moved from one high security facility to a much lower security facility because of the evidence that she was prepared, evidence in inverted commas, that she was prepared to give to a congressional committee. But what intrigues me is that why are the two men who have so far suffered most from their association with Epstein both been British? Why is it Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Peter Mandelson? Why do we take note of what has happened, but not America, and not the Americans? Why is that?
I agree with you. And the whole play is, let's get Andrew over there, or he's got to give some evidence. Let's get Mandelson over there. Let's get Sarah Ferguson now. Let's get her over there to give evidence. Where are the Bill Gates? And Clinton has given evidence, I get that. Branson said that he didn't really know him, but he was mentioned in the files. There are other royal families around the world who are involved in this too. But I don't see any man of any influence who has put his head above the parapet to explain the connection with him and Epstein. Now, will this come out? Mark, the brother who is behind this new independent team of pathologists, says that Epstein told him that, his brother told him he had some dirty gossip on some big influential names. He was suggesting before the 2016 presidential election that his brother had dirt on people involved in that election that could bring them down. Didn't mention anybody who was standing then. Of course, Donald Trump went on to become the president. But he had dirt on people that would kill their careers, but he's decided not to use it. So, coming back to the original thought here, there were a lot of people who didn't want him to sing like a canary.
I'm sure that's true. But then, again, in terms of evidence, again, in terms of how do we stand that up? Well, we can't stand that up. We can't stand up what Jeffrey Epstein may or may not have said to his brother. We can't definitively come to a conclusion about that as being authentic or inauthentic.
And why can't the women who are the victims, are they not allowed to name names?
Of course they're allowed to name names, but they may have signed confidentiality agreements. They may have felt it's not in their interest to do so because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. They may feel that they're waiting for the appropriate time to say something about this. And some of them have said things about other individuals.
For Virginia Giuffre.
Virginia Giuffre. And of course, Virginia Giuffre takes her own life. And so again, that might be something that discourages more young women from coming forward to say what happened to them. But we're into this, how many tentacles, how many connections Epstein had to different industries, to different influencers within politics, within government, within the media. Woody Allen. I've been listening and reading what Woody Allen has said about his connections. The president of Harvard University. The connections that Epstein had were over many different areas of public life, and it just shows enough money and you get seduced by people into their world. And that's where I think we've got to remember there's a consistency between Epstein's behavior in the community and what's going to happen to Epstein in prison. He imports a culture where he's very good at seducing people and getting them to do his bidding. He imports that ability to his life in the jail. He's very good at seducing people and getting them to do his bidding. And so they don't check on him. So he is in the cell by himself. So he is allowed phone calls when he shouldn't be allowed phone calls. And I would come back to the fact that 2 days before he takes his own life, he is signing his last will and testament. And these for me are behaviors that indicate this is somebody who's drawing a line for himself under his existence.
Mark Epstein's in an interesting situation by going so public with this. And he has said some fairly, very libelous things in the past about Donald Trump, to the point he's suggesting that Donald Trump's argument about his relationship with Epstein was as soon as he found out how awful Epstein was, he dropped him like a ton of bricks. But actually, Mark Epstein is saying, no, it's the other way around. Once my brother discovered what Donald Trump was like, he ended the relationship. But I presume he has to be careful what he's doing now, because while there'll be a lot of people who would rather Jeffrey Epstein didn't say anything, Mark Epstein has to be careful too, because there may be the same kind of threat, that kind of latent threat out there as to anybody who puts their head above the parapet and talks about that whole kind of network, clearly, that Jeffrey Epstein was involved with.
And that's one of the reasons, remember, that returns to one of the reasons why some of the young women involved haven't necessarily shared everything that they might want to share. I think it's slightly different for Mark Epstein, because if Mark Epstein was to die in suspicious circumstances, that would merely add another layer to the conspiracy theory that one would begin to start tipping over into thinking this is too unusual to be a coincidence.
Where does it go? Where does it end?
Well, I want it to end by...
This is 2019 he died.
Yeah.
And we're still 6 years on, 7 years on, still going on about it.
Well, I don't think it's going to end until all the files are released. And I think once that happens, then there's a lot in the public domain that people will be able to make a judgment about for themselves. So when will all the files be released? I think we'll see those released if there's an incoming democratic government in the United States, as opposed to another returning Republican government in the United States. So that will be one form of an ending. The second form of an ending will come when the girls and young women involved feel that they have got justice. That will be another form of an ending. And so there will be an end to this. But I would go back to the shock that you had when I said Rickrolling. This is beyond Epstein now. This is simply about a moment in history when the United States, which has always been very hesitant to accept government, especially big government. I mean, America was formed on the basis of rebelling against the British government, if you think about it. This is beyond. The Epstein case transcends the kinds of issues that we've been talking to, because it becomes a motif. It becomes emblematic of that distrust that's built into American culture, that they don't like government and governments will lie. And we, the small people, can never get justice because there will always be people who game the system. So that's really what we've been talking about, a disbelief about what happens to Epstein taking his own life, because that disbelief is embedded in the American psyche.
And you add in from our patch of the world, Fergie, Andrew, and Mandelson. 3 players who were arguably almost a bit players in the big Epstein story, but they are, even in America, they seem to have dominated the inquiry.
Well, they have to dominate the inquiry because it's easier to poke a finger across the Atlantic at what about the Brits, isn't it, than it is to start poking a finger at some of the Americans that we know have been associated with it. Because then for libel reasons, it's much easier to look to Britain as opposed to look at what's happening in Texas or California or wherever some of the people that we know are involved with Epstein are currently living.
It's not over, and I'm quite sure we'll be returning to this maybe when the bombshell thing comes out, and you can knock that down again as well.
But I mean, and let me go back, because you set out a very strong case. Has anything that we've discussed, and my kind of more skeptical, has a view about the fact that he may have been murdered, has any of that changed your view, or are you still of the belief that he was murdered?
Yeah, and I don't think it's a conspiracy. I am still confused as to, or I still have this niggling doubt. It was quite a big doubt, more than a niggle, in that no wealthy, powerful man has been taken to task, has been arrested, has been accused that we know of all these years on, and yet we know there will have been quite a few of them who were involved in this. And every single one of them, you would think, as I said before, would not want Jeffrey Epstein to sing like a canary, do a plea bargain, do anything at all that could bring the story to their doorstep.
And you know, one of the things, therefore, so that's interesting, because one of the things that we've touched on that I didn't know we were going to touch.
Epstein didn't play in the world of plumbers and social workers and have some nurses or doctors, even doctors around. He dealt in high net worth individuals. That was his shtick. Yeah. That was it. So where are they? Where are they then?
And so the reason why, and the word that we've not used is class. And of course, we've drawn attention to Andrew and Fergie and Mandelson, Lord Mandelson. We've drawn attention to what is essentially class. And America, quite apart from always being skeptical about government, has always been incredibly skeptical about the class system, a disbelief in the class system, that everybody is created equal, that you can go from log cabin to White House. And that's again why I think instinctively there have been no charges brought against some of those individuals who we know are involved with Epstein, because what it really would show is that there is actually a functioning class system in the United States, which isn't based on hereditary peerages, but is based instead on having squillions of money.
Filthy lucre.
So you loved that. That was a good
Is that how you pronounce it? Lucre.
Lucre, I would have thought.
Lucre.
But lucre, I quite like lucre.
Filthy lucre.
But please, could we say, if anybody out there from the United States, I really would like to know much more about Nicholas Tartaglione. I really would like to pursue some of that incident that occurs prior to what's going to happen on the 10th of August, because that seemed to me to be a rehearsal. I would interpret that as a rehearsal behavior. And Nicholas Tartaglione, therefore should be able to give us a very good insight into Epstein's state of mind.
So many of you have been asking for us to give you more. So we're going to do that. We're going to call it our murder club, basically. And it's going to be with Patreon. It's a wall where if you subscribe, we will offer you lots of extra things, including a newsletter, mainly written by my good professor of criminology here, sometimes by me. So we'll form a little community of ourselves, of This Much Is True Crime, with he and me. You'll find the link in the description of this episode. So please sign up if you can for all the extra goodies that we're going to bring you. If you enjoy what we do here, please remember to follow us or hit subscribe buttons. Do whatever you can, because it really means that, we're not just talking in a vacuum, that there's someone listening and watching.
And by this time next week, we'll have started our tour, Martin.
We will. So thank you in advance for coming to see us. Thanks for watching This Much Is True Crime, the podcast. If you enjoyed what you've seen and heard, then please follow and subscribe.